The air in the Mississippi Delta hangs thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of humidity, and the sweet, sickly scent of decay. In the year of our Lord, 1828, this land was a place of stark contrasts, of opulent white-columned manors standing defiantly against the wild, untamed swamps that bled into the horizon. It was a land built on a bedrock of human suffering, where the clang of chains was as common as the chirping of crickets in the twilight. But even in a place so accustomed to casual brutality, there are whispers of evils so profound, so fundamentally unnatural, that they curdle the blood and haunt the very soil for generations. Our story begins not with a scream, but with a silence, a deep, unnerving quiet that had fallen over the infirmary of the Blackwood Bend plantation, a sprawling cotton empire owned by a man of medicine, a man of science, Dr. Alastair Finch. On a moonless night in late August, a house slave named Hester, her hands trembling, crept towards the small, detached brick building that served as the doctor's private clinic. She was sent to fetch a poultice for the master's wife, but she was driven by a more primal, terrifying curiosity. For weeks the other enslaved women had spoken in hushed, fearful tones of Alara, a young field hand in the late stages of her pregnancy, who had been taken to the infirmary for a supposed birthing fever and had not been seen since. The official word was that she and the child had perished, but the whispers told a different, more forbidden story. They spoke of sounds, not of childbirth, but of something else, something metallic, something rhythmic and cold. As Hester reached the infirmary door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. A single sliver of lamplight cut through the oppressive darkness, painting a long, thin stripe across the damp earth. A low, guttural moan drifted out, a sound of agony so deep it seemed to come from the soul itself. It was not Elara's voice. It was someone new. Gathering every ounce of her courage, Hester pushed the heavy wooden door, and the scene that unfolded before her would forever be seared into the annals of this cursed place. A vision of macabre science and unholy ambition that defied all reason and compassion. The room was a grotesque theater of medicine. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood mixed with the sterile, chemical scent of carbolic acid, a smell of clean death. On a crude operating table in the center of the room lay a young, pregnant woman, her name lost to the callous indifference of history. Her eyes were wide with a terror that transcended pain, her body restrained by thick leather straps. And standing over her, illuminated by the flickering oil lamp, was the silhouette of Dr. Alastair Finch. He was not attending to a birth. His instruments were not the gentle tools of a physician meant to heal, but the cold, gleaming steel of a butcher or a watchmaker. Spread out on a nearby tray were scalpels of unusual thinness, long, curved forceps, and a bizarre, clockwork-like device of brass and glass tubing that Hester could not comprehend. The doctor worked with a chilling, detached focus, his brow furrowed in concentration, his lips moving as he mumbled measurements and observations to himself, recording them in a large, leather-bound ledger. He seemed entirely oblivious to the humanity of the woman beneath him, seeing her only as a vessel, a biological puzzle to be disassembled and studied. Hester's breath caught in her throat, a choked gasp that was swallowed by the room's horrifying ambience. She saw jars lining the shelves, and their contents made her stomach lurch. They held not herbs or tinctures, but pale, malformed things suspended in murky, yellowish fluid, infant limbs, twisted organs, things that should never have seen the light of day. This was not an infirmary. It was a laboratory. It was a charnel house dedicated to a forbidden, unholy pursuit. What was he searching for? What monstrous question was he trying to answer by dissecting the very process of life's creation? Hester backed away slowly, her mind reeling, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had seen the truth. The women who went into Dr. Finch's care did not die from fever. They were sacrifices on the altar of his macabre science. She fled into the night, but the image of his cold, calculating eyes and the glint of steel in the lamplight would haunt her forever. The secret of Blackwood Bend was far darker than anyone could have possibly imagined. To understand the horror that unfolded at Blackwood Bend, one must first understand its master. Dr. Alastair Finch was not the brutish, whip-wielding stereotype of a plantation owner. On the surface, he was a man of the Enlightenment, a figure of sophistication and learning in the rustic Mississippi frontier. He had been educated in Edinburgh, the medical capital of the world. At Savory Hall, anatomists argued over the mysteries of the human body. He spoke of progress, of science, and of the sacred duty of the physician to peel back the layers of ignorance that shrouded the miracle of life. To his peers in the nearby town of Natchez, he was a gentleman, well-read, softly spoken, and possessing a brilliant medical mind. They saw his plantation not as a mere cotton farm, but as a grand social and scientific experiment. He claimed he was creating a model of health and efficiency, using his medical knowledge to improve the stock and longevity of his enslaved workforce. He published papers in obscure medical journals on topics like maternal nutrition in the Negroid race and the prevention of puerperal fevers in plantation settings. These writings were seen as progressive, even humane, for the time. They painted a picture of a man dedicated to preserving the lives of the very people he held in bondage, a benevolent, paternalistic figure. But this public facade was a carefully constructed lie, a mask for a soul consumed by a chilling and obsessive ambition. His time in Edinburgh had exposed him not only to legitimate science, but also to its dark underbelly, to the world of the resurrection, ravers who sat at the enemy tables, and the radical theorists who whispered of ideas far beyond the accepted medical ethics of the day. They spoke of an idea that became Finch's obsession, the concept of maternal impressions. A disturbing, now discredited theory that a mother's emotional state, her very thoughts and fears during pregnancy, could physically alter the fetus in her womb. Could terror be imprinted onto flesh? Could a mother's soul literally shape the child? This was the forbidden question that drove him. And on his isolated Mississippi plantation, with an unlimited supply of human subjects who had no rights, no voice, and no hope of escape, he had the perfect, silent laboratory to find his answer. The Blackwood Bend plantation was a world unto itself, a kingdom ruled by Finch's absolute authority. It was geographically isolated, separated from its nearest neighbors by miles of dense, unforgiving cypress swamp and winding, muddy rivers. This isolation was deliberate. It was a shield. Behind the veil of lush Spanish moss and the facade of a prosperous cotton operation, a far more sinister harvest was being cultivated. The enslaved population lived in a state of constant, low-grade dread that was distinct from the typical hardships of plantation. Here, the fear the overseer's whip, but the doctor's gentle, probing questions. Dr. Finch took an unusually keen interest in the pregnancies of his female slaves. While most plantation owners saw a pregnant slave as a temporary loss of a field hand, Finch viewed them as invaluable assets for his research. He would select specific women, often young and pregnant for the first time, and remove them from the fields, placing them in a separate, isolated cabin near his infirmary. He called it the lying-in house. To outsiders, this seemed a gesture of remarkable kindness. He claimed it was to provide them with better nutrition and to protect them from the rigors of field labor, ensuring a healthy birth. But the women who were chosen knew it was a curse. They vanished from the community of the slave quarters, entering a world of sterile silence, daily examinations, and the doctor's unnerving, analytical gaze. The other slaves would watch as these women were led away, their eyes filled with a helpless terror. They knew the truth. The lying-in house was not a sanctuary. It was a cage. It was a holding pen where Finch could control every aspect of his subjects' existence, their diet, their sleep, and most importantly, their psychological state. It was here in this controlled environment that his true experiments began, long before the first incision was ever made. The women in that house were not patients. They were raw material for a horrifying hypothesis. And as each one was taken for her confinement in the infirmary, the dread in the slave quarters would deepen, for they all knew the terrible truth. The chances of seeing her, or her child, alive again were almost zero. The experiments did not begin with the knife. They began with the mind. Dr. Finch was a meticulous record keeper, and his ledgers, written in a precise, spidery script, detailed the first phase of his Macabre protocol. He believed that to truly test the theory of maternal impressions, he needed to soft terror. The women isolated in the lying-in house were subjected to a relentless campaign of psychological torture, a methodology so cruel and calculated it chills the bone. He would begin with sensory deprivation, keeping a woman in a windowless room in complete darkness and silence for days on end, only to shatter the quiet with sudden, terrifying sounds. A screaming animal, the sea. Lash of iron, or recordings of human wails played on a strange, imported phonograph. He documented their physiological responses with cold, scientific detachment, the spike in their heart rate, the sweat on their brow, the pleas for mercy that he meticulously transcribed. He would then move on to more elaborate torments. He would stage horrifying scenes for them to witness through a peephole, making them watch staged acts of violence, or confronting them with grotesque anatomical models he had constructed from animal parts and wax. He was particularly interested in the power of folklore and superstition. He learned the ghost stories and dark legends of his slaves' African heritage and twisted them, using actors from among the more brutal overseers to play the parts of terrifying spirits or demons, appearing in the dead of night to whisper threats against the unborn child. Each woman was a different experiment. For one, he might focus on inducing profound grief, telling her that her family in the main quarters had perished in a fire. For another, he would cultivate paranoia, whispering that the other pregnant women were plotting to harm her baby. He noted every tear, every scream, every prayer, believing that these intense emotional outpourings were the catalysts, the invisible chisels that were sculpting the flesh and bone of the fetuses growing within their wombs. He wasn't just observing them. He was trying to create monsters, both literally and figuratively, to prove a theory that no sane mind would ever dare to test. If you are finding this exploration into forbidden history compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. The methods of Dr. Finch's madness only grow more disturbing from here. As the pregnancies of his chosen subjects progressed, Dr. Finch's methods escalated, moving from the psychological to the physiological. His journals from this period are a disturbing litany of non-consensual medical procedures, all performed under the guise of prenatal care. He was obsessed with the idea that he could directly interact with the fetus in the womb, a concept that was pure, horrifying fantasy in the medicine of 1828. He developed a series of long, thin needles and probes, instruments of his own design, which he used to perform what he called in utero manipulations. He would restrain the terrified, pregnant women, and without any form of anesthetic, attempt to puncture the amniotic sac. His notes are filled with chillingly detached descriptions of these procedures. He writes of attempting to inject substances directly into the womb, dyes to see if they would stain the fetal skin, chemical irritants to provoke a reaction, and even animal blood based on a deranged theory that it might alter the child's nature. Most of these attempts were disastrous failures, resulting in infection, premature labor, and the deaths of both mother and child. But to Finch, these were not tragedies. They were simply data points. Each dead mother, each stillborn infant, was a specimen to be dissected. He would work for hours in his locked infirmary, performing meticulous autopsies, searching for any sign, any minuscule physical anomaly that might suggest his psychological or chemical torments had left their mark on the developing fetus. He was looking for proof of his theories in their very viscera. He documented the size of their organs, the shape of their bones, the color of their tissues, always searching for a deviation from the norm. The slave quarters fell under a pall of silent grief. The men would see their wives and partners led away, knowing they were marching towards an almost certain horrific end. The women lived in constant fear of being chosen. Pregnancy, which should have been a sign of life and continuity, became a death sentence at Blackwood Bend. It was a banned topic, a source of unspeakable dread. The plantation was no longer a farm. It was a factory of death, fueled by one man's monstrous obsession, and the infirmary was its horrifying centerpiece, a place where the screams of the living were dissected in the name of a forbidden science. Not all of Dr. Finch's subjects perished during his cruel experiments. A few, through sheer resilience or perhaps a fluke of his methods, survived to term. But these births were not moments of relief. They were the terrifying culmination of his work. Finch did not allow for natural childbirth. The delivery room was an operating theater, and he was the sole, grim surgeon. He saw the moment of birth as the final, crucial stage of his experiment, a moment he had to control completely. It was for this purpose that he became an early and brutal pioneer of the cesarean section. In an era before antiseptics or antibiotics and long before anesthesia was reliable, this procedure was almost invariably fatal for the mother. But Finch was not concerned with the mother's survival. Her purpose was fulfilled. She was merely the vessel, and he was there to claim the contents. Iwi. Tines accounts, passed down through generations of the enslaved families who survived Blackwood Bend, speak of these horrifying procedures. They describe how the women would be strapped down, fully conscious, their pleas and screams echoing from the brick infirmary as Finch made his incisions. He worked with a surgeon's precision but without a shred of empathy, cutting through layers of skin, muscle, and womb to extract the infant. His focus was entirely on the newborn. He would snatch the child away the moment it was born, often before it could even draw its first breath, handing it off to a terrified assistant while he callously stitched the mother closed, leaving her to almost certainly die from infection or blood loss in the days that followed. Her body, too, would then become a specimen for his dissection table. But it was the children who were the true prize. These infants, born from months of calculated terror and physical torment, were the living proof he sought. He would whisk them away to a hidden nursery, a part of the infirmary no one else was ever allowed to enter. What happened to these children? This became the most haunting mystery of Blackwood Bend. They were never seen again. They were not added to the plantation's official records of enslaved persons. They simply vanished. They were ghosts, born of horror and claimed by a madman science. The fate of the infants born in Dr. Finch's abattoir of an infirmary is where this dark history descends into a truly macabre cold case. While Finch's ledgers were detailed in their descriptions of the experiments on the mothers, they become cryptic and coded when referring to the children. He refers to them not by name, but by case number, specimen 7, specimen 9. He notes their physical characteristics with an unnerving focus on anything unusual: a birthmark, a slightly misshapen finger, a vacant or unusually intense gaze. He meticulously documents their reflexes, their cries, their sleep patterns, as if studying a new species of animal. But then, after a few weeks of these cold observations, the entries for each child simply stop. The official explanation, if anyone was brave enough to ask, was always the same. The child was weak and had succumbed to an infant malady, but no graves were ever marked. No bodies were ever returned to the families. They were erased. Whispers among the enslaved community offered a more horrifying theory. Some said the doctor continued his experiments on the newborns, dissecting them to search for the physical imprints of their mothers, terror in their tiny brains and organs. This theory is horrifyingly plausible, given his obsession and complete lack of morality. But another, even more disturbing rumor persisted, a story told only in the darkest corners of the night. It spoke of a secret room in the cellar of the infirmary, a place where the children were kept alive. It was said that Finch was not just studying the effects of prenatal terror, but was now studying its aftermath. He was raising these children in controlled, isolated environments to see if the terror he had instilled in the womb would manifest as they grew. Was he trying to cultivate a generation of humans devoid of empathy, or defined by fear? The idea is monstrous. A secret, hidden nursery of traumatized children, raised in darkness by a mad scientist, there lives nothing more than the final chapter in his depraved experiment. This rumor, more than any other, cemented the legacy of Blackwood Bend as a place of profound, unnatural evil. The doctor wasn't just a murderer. He was a creator of a different sort, attempting to craft human minds from a blueprint of pure horror. Dr. Finch was a man who lived behind walls, the literal walls of his isolated plantation and the figurative walls of his professional reputation. But such profound evil cannot be entirely contained. Cracks began to appear in his carefully constructed facade. A local minister, a man named Reverend Thomas Abernathy, would occasionally visit the larger plantations to offer spiritual guidance to the enslaved, a practice tolerated by owners as a means of social control. Abernathy was a deeply observant man, and during his visits to Blackwood Bend, he sensed a palpable atmosphere of fear that was different from other estates. The slaves here were not just weary and oppressed, they were haunted. They would flinch at his questions, their eyes darting nervously towards the doctor's house. He noticed the unnerving absence of pregnant women in the main quarters and the complete lack of infants or young children. On one visit in the spring of 1831, he attempted to speak with a woman who had recently survived one of Finch's procedures. She was a ghost of her former self, gaunt, her eyes hollow and vacant. When the Reverend gently asked about her child, she began to tremble violently, muttering a single cryptic phrase over and over again. "He takes the eyes. He takes the eyes." The woman was Declar. Ed mad by Finch and locked away, but her words planted a seed of profound suspicion in Abernathy's mind. He began to make discreet inquiries in Natchez. He discovered that Finch ordered strange and unusual supplies from apothecaries and importers in New Orleans, not just medical equipment, but large quantities of formaldehyde, glass jars of specific sizes, and intricate brass mechanisms that no country doctor would ever need. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Abernathy spoke with a disgruntled former overseer who had been dismissed by Finch for drunkenness. The man, seeking revenge, told the Reverend a horrifying story. He spoke of being ordered to build a special, soundproofed room in the cellar of the infirmary. He described seeing the doctor carrying small, blanket-trapped bundles down into that cellar in the dead of night. And he spoke of the sounds, faint, muffled cries that were sometimes abruptly silenced. Reverend Abernathy now knew that he was standing on the edge of a horrifying abyss, a darkness far deeper than he could have ever imagined. He had to act, but in a world where the word of a wealthy landowner was law and the victims had no voice, what could one man possibly do? Reverend Abernathy was a man of God, but he was also a pragmatist. He knew that a direct accusation against a man of Dr. Finch's standing would be dismissed as hysterical nonsense, especially since his only evidence was the rambling of a mad slave woman and the testimony of a disgraced drunkard. He needed something concrete, something undeniable. He decided on a course of action that was both brave and incredibly reckless. He would break into the infirmary himself. He planned his infiltration for a specific night when he knew Dr. Finch would be away in Natchez, attending a meeting of a local scientific society. Under the cover of a thunderstorm that lashed the Mississippi landscape, Abernathy made his way to Blackwood Bend. The plantation was eerily quiet, the storm having driven everyone indoors. He found the infirmary locked, as expected, but the former overseer had told him about a loose shutter on a back window. With his heart pounding in his chest, the Reverend pried it open and slipped inside. The room was just as Hester had seen it years before, a place of cold, clinical horror. The shelves were lined with specimen jars, their grotesque contents obscured by the murky fluid. The air was stale, thick with the lingering scent of chemicals, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet. Abernathy lit a small lantern, its light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock him. He first examined the doctor's ledgers, which were left open on a desk. He could not decipher the complex medical terminology, but he understood the cold, numerical way Finch cataloged human lives. He saw lists of names, dates, and then a final, chilling entry beside most of them: specimen harvested. His stomach turned. He knew he was in the presence of a truly diabolical evil. Then his eyes were drawn to a heavy wooden trapdoor in the floor, partially concealed by a bearskin rug. It was the entrance to the cellar the overseer had described. With trembling hands, Abernathy grasped the iron ring and pulled. The door groaned open, revealing a set of steep stone steps that descended into absolute blackness. A wave of cold, foul-smelling air washed over him, a stench of damp earth, mildew, and something else, something sickeningly organic. He took a deep breath, held his lantern high, and began his descent into the heart of Dr. Finch's forbidden world. The cellar was colder than the storm-swept night outside, a damp, sepulchral cold that seemed to cling to the Reverend's skin and seep into his bones. The air was thick with the smell of mold and confinement. His lantern light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing a small, stone-walled chamber. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple storage cellar with shelves holding crates and barrels. But as his eyes adjusted, Reverend Abernathy realized the horrifying truth. This was no storage room. It was a nursery from a nightmare. Along one wall were several small, crude wooden cribs. They were empty. But the sight of them, arranged in a neat, clinical row, was profoundly disturbing. In the corner, a small table held a collection of bizarre objects. Strange, articulated toys made of polished bone and metal, feeding bottles with unnaturally long, thin spouts, and a set of tiny leather restraints. It was a place designed for infants, but it lacked any semblance of warmth, comfort, or humanity. It was a laboratory for the study of children. Then Abernathy saw the shelves. They were not filled with supplies. They were an archive of horror. Row upon row of large glass jars stood like silent sentinels, and inside each jar, suspended in a pale amber fluid, was a human infant. They were perfectly preserved, their tiny hands clenched, their faces frozen in expressions that air impossible to read. But it was their eyes that caused the Reverend to stumble back, a cry of horror catching in his throat. In some of the infants, the eyes were a milky white. In others, they were gone entirely, leaving only dark, empty sockets. The slave woman's words echoed in his mind. He takes the eyes. What monstrous obsession was this? What was Finch searching for in the eyes of these tormented children? Was he looking for a physical manifestation of the soul? A physiological sign of the terror their mothers had endured? The sight was an abomination, a blasphemy against God and nature. Abernathy felt a wave of nausea and vertigo. He had found his proof, but it was a truth so horrifying, so far beyond the pale of human wickedness, that he feared no one would ever believe him. He was alone in a madman's museum of suffering, a testament to a science that had descended into the deepest, darkest pits of hell. Reeling from the macabre discovery in the cellar, Reverend Abernathy knew he could not stay. He had seen enough to condemn 100 men. He scrambled back up the stone steps, his mind a whirlwind of horror and revulsion. He had to get to the authorities in Natchez. He had to expose Alastair Finch for the monster he was. He fled the infirmary, leaving the trapdoor agape, and ran through the driving rain, his heart filled with a righteous fury. He reached Natchez by dawn, soaked and exhausted, and went straight to the office of the local magistrate, a man named Judge Carter. Abernathy burst in and, in a torrent of frantic words, recounted everything he had witnessed: the psychological torture, the fatal surgeries, the cryptic ledgers, and the final, unthinkable horror of the preserved infants in the cellar. He spoke of the woman's cryptic warning: "He takes the eyes." Judge Carter, a stern and pragmatic man, listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Abernathy finished, his voice hoarse with emotion, the judge was silent for a long moment. He then calmly stated that the accusations were of the gravest nature. He assured the Reverend that he would look into the matter personally and dispatched a deputy to ride to Blackwood Bend with Dr. Finch to inspect the premises. Abernathy, though shaken, felt a glimmer of hope. The law would finally intervene. Justice would be served. But the South in 1831 was a closed society, a web of power, wealth, and influence. Dr. Finch was not just a physician. He was a wealthy landowner, a member of the planter elite. Judge Carter was his contemporary, a man he likely knew from social clubs and business dealings. The Reverend's hope soon turned to ash. The deputy returned late that afternoon with a report. Dr. Finch had been fully cooperative, the deputy claimed. He had shown them his infirmary, a model of cleanliness and modern medicine. He explained that the specimen jars contained anatomical curiosities from his time in Edinburgh, used for teaching purposes. And the cellar? It was a simple root cellar. There were no cribs, no jars, no preserved infants. It was empty, save for a few barrels of salted meat. Dr. Finch, with a sad shake of his head, suggested that the poor reverend was overwrought, perhaps suffering from a fever-induced delusion brought on by his frantic ride in the storm. The official investigation was closed. The system had closed ranks around its own. Dr. Finch's word, backed by his wealth and status, outweighed the delusions of a country preacher. Reverend Abernathy was publicly discredited. He was ostracized by his peers and accused of slander against a respected gentleman. His righteous crusade had ended in utter failure, his reputation shattered. He was left with the horrifying knowledge of what he had seen and the sickening realization that he was powerless to stop it. He had looked into the face of pure evil, and the world had simply looked away. But how had Finch done it? How had he managed to sanitize the horrors of his cellar in just a few hours? The answer lay in the very system of oppression that enabled his crimes in the first place. Upon being alerted by the deputy, Finch would have returned to his plantation with a furious urgency. He would have used his absolute power over his enslaved population to erase the evidence. The overseers, loyal to their master and complicit in his secrets, would have forced a team of slaves to work at a frantic pace. The cribs would have been dismantled and burned. The gruesome collection of jars containing the preserved infants would have been loaded onto a wagon. But where would they go? The surrounding swamps offered the perfect hiding place. It's believed that the wagon was driven deep into the bayou, into a labyrinth of black water and cypress knees where no one would ever venture. There in the dead of night, the jars, the only physical evidence of Finch's monstrous crimes, were likely cast into the murky depths, sinking into the mud to be lost forever. The children of Blackwood Bend, Den, Wide Life, were now also denied a grave, their final resting place a secret kept by the silent, brooding swamp. Finch had orchestrated a perfect cover-up. He had used the very people he victimized to bury the evidence of his atrocities. When Judge Carter's deputy arrived, there was nothing to see. The Reverend's story was rendered the stuff of fantasy, a macabre fairy tale. Finch was safe. His experiments could continue. And now he knew he was untouchable. The darkness at Blackwood Bend was free to grow, unchecked and unpunished. Dr. Finch's close call with exposure seemed only to embolden him. Having faced down the law and won, he now operated with a sense of complete impunity. His research, however, took a new, even more disturbing turn. The events had taught him that his collection of preserved specimens was a liability. He needed a new way to document his findings, a method that could not be so easily discovered or destroyed. His focus shifted away from preserving the entire bodies of the infants. Now he was interested only in the parts he deemed most crucial to his theory, the brain and, most particularly, the eyes. His obsession with the eyes of the newborns intensified. He had read obscure anatomical texts that posited the optic nerve as a direct conduit to the soul, believing that the physical structure of the eye could hold a literal, physiological record of the mother's emotional trauma. The phrase, "he takes the eyes," was not the rambling of a madwoman. It was a literal description of his new procedure. After his horrifying, non-anesthetic cesarean sections, he would perform a grotesque dissection on the still-living or freshly deceased newborn. He would carefully extract the brain and the eyes, preserving them in smaller, more easily concealed jars. The rest of the infant's body, now just discarded tissue to him, was disposed of in the most callous way imaginable, likely buried in unmarked pits deep in the woods, or even rendered down in live vats in a hidden corner of the plantation. His ledgers from this period reflect this shift. The detailed anatomical drawings of entire infants are replaced by intricate, almost artistic renderings of neural pathways and cross-sections of the human eye. He filled pages with bizarre, pseudoscientific theories, attempting to link the patterns of retinal fibers to specific fears he had induced in the mother. He wrote of calcified terror in the optic chiasm and sorrow-induced lesions on the cerebral cortex. It was the work of a man who had completely detached from reality, a scientist who had replaced the scientific method with a self-justifying, murderous delusion. The infirmary at Blackwood Bend had transformed from a theater of macabre birth into a specialized processing facility, designed for the efficient harvesting of infant organs. The horror had not stopped. It had simply become more focused, more precise, and more profoundly evil. For several more years, the silent, systematic horror at Blackwood Bend continued. The cycle of fear, experimentation, and death became a grim, unspoken reality of life on the plantation. The number of women and children who vanished into Dr. Finch's infirmary is impossible to calculate with certainty. The official plantation records were a work of fiction, and the true toll was buried in unmarked graves and recorded only in the doctor's secret, coded ledgers. But evil of this magnitude creates its own energy. It stains the land, poisoning the very atmosphere. The plantation began to decay, not just morally but physically. The crop yields declined. A strange sickness seemed to afflict the livestock. The grand manor house itself began to show signs of neglect, its white paint peeling, its gardens overgrown with weeds. It was as if the unnatural acts being committed in the infirmary were radiating outward, a curse that blighted everything it touched. Finch himself became more reclusive, more paranoid. He rarely left the plantation, trusting no one. He was seen less and less, spending almost all of his time locked away in his laboratory, surrounded by his gruesome collection of preserved brains and eyes, poring over his notes. His public persona as a sophisticated gentleman dissolved, replaced by rumors of a gaunt, wild-eyed man who muttered to himself and shunned the sunlight. The few visitors who came to Blackwood Bend spoke of a profound sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, and an oppressive silence that was heavier and more menacing than the summer heat. The enslaved population, trapped in this decaying nightmare, developed their own folklore about the place. They said the spirits of the murdered mothers and their children haunted the grounds, their sorrowful cries echoing through the swamps on moonless nights. They spoke of a dark entity, a shadow man that lurked near the infirmary, a being they believed was either the ghost of Finch's first victim or perhaps the devil himself, drawn to the plantation by the S. Here concentration of suffering. Blackwood Bend was no longer just a place of cruelty. It was becoming a nexus of the macabre, a place where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the tormented dead was growing dangerously thin. The stage was being set for a final, horrifying act. If you want to hear more forbidden histories like this, subscribe now, because what follows is even darker. The catalyst for the final chapter of Blackwood Bend arrived in the form of a woman named Sarah. Unlike many of the other women Finch had chosen, Sarah was not a young, first-time mother. She was older, in her late 30s, and had already given birth to 2 healthy children who had grown into young adults. She possessed a fierce, quiet strength and was a respected figure in the slave community, a keeper of stories and traditions. When Finch selected her for his lying-in house, a wave of cold fury, not just fear, rippled through the quarters. It felt like a personal attack on their community's heart. Sarah, however, was not a passive victim. She had watched for years as her friends and kin were led to the infirmary, never to return. She knew exactly what awaited her, and in the days leading up to her confinement, she did something remarkable. She planned her resistance. She could not fight Finch with physical force, but she could fight him with the only weapon she had, her mind and her will. She secretly instructed her eldest son, a young man named Jacob, on what to do. She gave him a small, carved wooden bird, a symbol of their family, and told him, "When the time comes, you will know what you must do with this. Do not let him finish what he starts." Jacob, his heart filled with a mixture of terror and grim determination, understood her meaning. It was not a plan for escape. It was a plan for justice, or perhaps for vengeance. When Finch's overseers came for Sarah, she did not weep or struggle. She walked with a calm, unnerving dignity that seemed to disturb her captors. As she was led into the infirmary, she looked back at her son one last time, a silent message passing between them. The cycle of horror was about to be broken. Sarah was not going to be just another specimen in Alastair Finch's collection. She was going to be his final subject. Her defiance, her refusal to be psychologically broken, would frustrate and enrage the doctor, pushing him to take risks he had never taken before and setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to a night of fire, blood, and a terrifying, long overdue reckoning. Inside the infirmary, Sarah proved to be unlike any subject Dr. Finch had ever encountered. Where others had succumbed to terror, she met his psychological torments with a stoic, unnerving silence. When he staged his horrifying apparitions, she would stare through them, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the charade. When he whispered his threats, she would begin to hum a low, ancient melody, a song from her ancestors that seemed to protect her, enraging him with its quiet power. Her resilience was a direct challenge to his entire theory. If he could not break her spirit, he could not imprint his desired terror onto her unborn child. His frustration mounted, turning into a cold, intellectual rage. His notes from this time are filled with angry, frantic scribblings about Subject S and her abnormal psychological fortitude. He saw her not as a strong woman, but as a flawed experiment, a puzzle that defied his control. This defiance drove him to abandon his usual, more measured protocols. He decided he would have to resort to a more direct, more brutal method to achieve the results he craved. He planned to perform his cesarean section on Sarah earlier than usual, but with a horrifying new addition to the procedure. He had developed a new theory, that the ultimate maternal impression, the purest and most potent form of terror, would occur if the mother could witness the dissection of her own child. It was an act of cruelty so profound, so unthinkable, it represented the absolute pinnacle of his madness. He constructed a special harness for the operating table, one that would hold the mother's head in place and force her eyes open. He arranged a series of mirrors, allowing her to have a clear, unobstructed view of the procedure as he performed it on her own newborn. This was his masterwork, the ultimate expression of his forbidden science. He was no longer just an observer of terror's effects. He was orchestrating a symphony of horror, with mother and child as his unwilling instruments. The night he chose for Sarah's delivery was dark and moonless, the air still and heavy. He was about to cross a final line, to commit an act so vile it seemed destined to call down some form of cosmic retribution. And outside, hidden in the shadows, Sarah's son Jacob watched the infirmary, clutching a wooden bird and a stolen tinderbox, waiting for his mother's signal. The interior of the infirmary that night was a scene from the deepest circle of hell. Sarah was strapped to the operating table, her head locked into Finch's cruel new contraption, her eyes forced to stare at the system of mirrors that reflected her own vulnerable body. Dr. Finch worked with a feverish intensity, his usual cold detachment replaced by a visible manic excitement. This was the culmination of his life's work. He made the first incision, ignoring Sarah's gasp of pain, but she did not scream. Her face was a mask of iron resolve. She fixed her gaze on Finch's reflection in the mirror, and the look in her eyes was not one of fear, but of pure, undiluted hatred, a look that promised retribution. This unnerved Finch, but he pressed on, driven by his obsession. He delivered the child, a healthy baby girl. For a fleeting moment, Sarah's iron will broke, and a sound of pure maternal anguish escaped her lips as the baby was taken from her. This was the sound Jacob had been waiting for. It was the signal. Hidden in the darkness near the infirmary wall, he struck the flint. A spark caught on the dry tinder. He touched the small flame to the bundle of oil-soaked rags he had prepared. The fire caught instantly, greedily. He shoved the burning bundle into a pile of dry cotton bales stacked against the infirmary's wooden frame, bales left there perhaps by a deliberately careless hand earlier that day. The flames roared to life, licking up the dry wooden walls with astonishing speed. Inside, Finch was just beginning his ghoulish dissection of the newborn, placing his scalpel to the infant's delicate skin, all while forcing Sarah to watch. It was at that moment that he first smelled the smoke. A flicker of alarm crossed his face. He glanced towards the door as a wave of thick black smoke began to pour in from under it. Panic erupted. His perfect, controlled environment was being consumed. His life's work, his precious specimens, his irreplaceable ledgers, all of it was in danger. His obsession, for a moment, was overshadowed by a primal fear of the fire. The experiment was over. The night of reckoning had begun. Chaos consumed the infirmary. The fire spread with unnatural speed, the dry timber of the old building acting as perfect kindling. Acrid smoke filled the room, choking the air and stinging the eyes. Dr. Finch, in a state of pure panic, abandoned Sarah and the newborn on the table. His first instinct was not to save himself or his victims, but to save his research. He scrambled towards the shelves, grabbing his ledgers and pulling down jars containing his most prized specimens, the preserved eyes and brains that represented years of his monstrous work. But the flames were now pouring through the windows, and the heat was becoming unbearable. The roof groaned above him, threatening to collapse. Outside, the night was alight. The orange glow of the fire could be seen for miles, a beacon of destruction in the Mississippi darkness. Jacob had already fled into the swamps, his heart pounding with a terrible mixture of grief and triumph. The slave quarters erupted in a mixture of panic and a fierce, secret joy. This was not just a fire, it was an uprising. It was judgment. Back inside the inferno, Sarah, still strapped to the table, summoned her last ounce of strength. The fire was weakening the leather straps. With a desperate, primal surge of adrenaline, she tore one arm free. She could not save her baby, who was likely already lost to the smoke, but she could exact her revenge. As Finch, his arms laden with his cursed research, turned to flee towards the cellar exit, Sarah grabbed the heaviest instrument she could reach, a thick glass beaker. With a guttural roar of a mother's fury, she hurled it at him. The beaker shattered against the back of his head. Finch staggered, dropping his precious jars, which smashed on the stone floor, their contents spilling out in a grotesque mess. He stumbled forward, dazed and disoriented by the blow and the smoke. In his confusion, he tripped and fell, his head striking the corner of the heavy operating table with a sickening crack. He lay there, stunned and bleeding, as the burning timbers from the ceiling began to rain down around him. The monster was trapped in his own museum of horrors, about to be consumed by the very flames of the hell he had created on Earth. The infirmary at Blackwood Bend burned to the ground, collapsing into a heap of smoldering ash and blackened brick. The fire was so intense that it was impossible to say for certain what or who was consumed within it. Sarah's body was never recovered, nor was that of her infant daughter. They were assumed to have perished in the flames, their sacrifice serving as the spark that ended the reign of terror. And Dr. Alastair Finch, he vanished. No body was ever definitively identified as his from the ruins. In the days that followed the fire, chaos reigned on the plantation. With the master gone and the symbol of his power destroyed, the rigid structure of control collapsed. Some slaves, like Jacob, used the confusion to escape into the swamps, seeking freedom. Others remained, uncertain of what the future held. The local authorities conducted a cursory investigation, but the fire was officially ruled an accident, caused by a stray spark from a lantern. The convenient disappearance of Dr. Finch was noted as a mystery, but one that no one was particularly motivated to solve. The story of his experiments, which had been dismissed as the ravings of Reverend Abernathy, was now buried under the ashes, becoming the stuff of legend and rumor. But a legend was born that night, whispered among the survivors and passed down through generations. It is said that Dr. Finch did not die in the fire. They say that he was horribly burned and disfigured, but that he managed to crawl out of the inferno and escape into the surrounding swamps. In this version of the story, he becomes a boogeyman, a creature of the bayou, the swamp doctor, a mad, scarred figure who haunts the murky waters, forever searching for new specimens for his lost collection. This chilling folklore served as a warning, a way to process the incomprehensible trauma that had occurred. The idea that Finch had been killed in the fire offered closure, but the idea that his evil still lurked in the darkness, transformed but not extinguished, was perhaps a more fitting testament to the profound and lasting nature of his crimes. The man was gone, but the curse he had created lingered. In the aftermath of the fire and the collapse of the plantation's hierarchy, The story of Blackwood Bend could have ended, but evil leaves a scar on the land itself. The plantation was eventually sold, its name changed, and its dark history deliberately scrubbed from the official records. But the land did not forget. Subsequent owners of the property reported a string of misfortunes and strange, unsettling phenomena. Crops failed to grow in the soil around the site of the old infirmary. Livestock would become inexplicably sick and die if they wandered too near the area. The place developed a reputation for being sour or cursed. People who lived on the property in the following decades spoke of a pervasive sense of sorrow and dread that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. They reported hearing faint, disembodied cries on still nights, the sound of a weeping woman or a distressed infant carried on the wind. Others claimed to see fleeting, shadowy figures moving at the edge of the swamps, particularly a tall, stooped figure that seemed to watch the main house from a distance. The legend of the swamp doctor grew, merging with the land's own haunted memory. Treasure hunters and curiosity seekers would occasionally venture onto the property, drawn by rumors of the mad doctor's buried secrets. They searched for his lost ledgers or the cellar where he kept his horrifying collection. Most found nothing but an eerie silence and a sense of being unwelcome. However, in the late 1890s, a group of men dredging a nearby bayou for cypress logs made a gruesome discovery. Their equipment pulled up a collection of rotted wooden crates from the thick mud at the bottom of the waterway. When they broke them open, they found them filled with dozens of large, sealed glass jars. The contents had long since decomposed into an unrecognizable organic sludge, but the nature of the discovery sent a chill through the local community. They had found Dr. Finch's lost collection, the final, horrific proof of Reverend Abernathy's story, dredged up from its watery grave after more than half a century. The jars were quickly and quietly disposed of, their contents reburied in an unmarked location, a secret once again consigned to the earth. The dredging of the specimen jars from the bayou resurrected the dark history of Blackwood Bend, ensuring it would never be fully forgotten. It became a piece of local lore, a ghost story told to frighten children, but one with a terrifying kernel of truth. The story of the doctor who experimented on pregnant slaves became a cautionary tale about the depths of human depravity when power is absolute and unchecked. It serves as a stark reminder of the countless, unrecorded horrors that occurred in the shadows of the institution of slavery, atrocities that were never brought to justice, and whose victims were never given a name or a proper burial. The science that drove Dr. Finch, the theory of maternal impressions, has long been discredited, dismissed as a pseudoscientific superstition. Yet the core idea, that trauma can be passed down through generations, has re-emerged in modern science under the name of epigenetics. We now understand that extreme stress and trauma can indeed leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, a scar that can be inherited by their children and their children's children. This modern understanding casts Finch's experiments in an even more horrifying light. While his methods were monstrous and his conclusions were madness, the fundamental premise that a mother's suffering could physically affect her offspring was, in a strange and twisted way, not entirely wrong. He was a man digging for a dark truth with the wrong tools, his scientific curiosity completely eclipsed by his monstrous cruelty and lack of humanity. This level of cruelty is almost incomprehensible, yet it was hidden in plain sight. We unearth these buried stories to ensure they are never forgotten. Help us keep these forbidden histories alive by hitting the like button and subscribing. Because the doctor's final objective was something no one could have ever imagined, and his legacy may not be entirely over. What was the ultimate goal of Dr. Alastair Finch? Was he merely a sadist, using the guise of science to inflict pain? Or was there a more complex, more terrifying ambition driving his madness? A closer examination of the few surviving fragments of his writings, coupled with the folklore that surrounded him, suggests a purpose far more esoteric than simple medical research. Finch wasn't just trying to prove that terror could alter flesh. He was trying to isolate the very essence of fear itself. In some of his more philosophical passages, He writes about the anima, the soul or life force, and speculates that powerful emotions like fear and sorrow are not just psychological events but tangible, perhaps even biological, substances that flow through the blood and are imprinted on the nervous system. His obsession with the eyes was key to this. He believed the eye was not just an organ of sight, but a lens for the soul. He thought that by dissecting the eyes of an infant born from pure terror, he might be able to find a physical trace of that terror, a unique protein, a specific cellular structure. He was, in essence, hunting for the physical embodiment of a human emotion. His ultimate goal, it seems, was to extract and distill this essence, to create a serum, a tincture of pure fear. For what purpose? His notes are maddeningly vague on this point. Perhaps he believed it could be a weapon. Or perhaps he saw it as a key to controlling others, a way to command obedience through a direct, biological application of terror. But the most disturbing theory is that he sought it for himself. Some interpret his writings as a quest for a kind of dark immortality, a belief that by understanding and consuming the essence of life's most powerful emotions, he could transcend the normal limits of human existence. He wasn't just a monster playing doctor. He was an alchemist of the soul, and his laboratory was not designed to heal bodies, but to deconstruct and render the very spirit. This transforms him from a mere murderer into something far more sinister, a man who sought to weaponize the human soul. The fire that destroyed the infirmary did not destroy Finch's legacy. In fact, it cemented it, transforming him from a man into a myth. The legend of the swamp doctor took on a life of its own, evolving over the decades. In some versions of the tale, he survives the fire and continues his experiments in a hidden laboratory deep in the swamps, capturing lost travelers and unlucky souls who stray too far from the beaten path. These stories say he uses the knowledge gleaned from his original experiments to create monstrous creatures, hybrids of man and beast, or to perform gruesome surgeries that twist the mind and body. In other versions, he becomes a supernatural entity, a spectral figure bound to the land he cursed. They say his ghost haunts the ruins of his plantation, forever searching for the lost jars containing the eyes of his victims, his spirit unable to rest until his collection is complete. This ghostly narrative became particularly potent. People claimed to see strange lights moving through the swamps at night, lights they believed were the doctor's lantern as he continued his eternal search. The site of the old infirmary became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in the occult and the macabre. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators have visited the site, claiming to record electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, that capture the faint cries of infants and the whispered, scientific ramblings of a man with a cold, calculating voice. These legends, while fantastic, speak to a deeper truth. Finch's evil was so profound that it could not be contained by a simple death. It needed a larger, more mythic vessel to be understood. The creation of a monster, a boogeyman, was the only way for the collective psyche of the community to process the reality of what one man was capable of. The historical Dr. Alastair Finch was a man of flesh and blood, but the entity he became, the Swamp Doctor, is a timeless embodiment of scientific ambition untethered from morality, a specter of forbidden knowledge that continues to haunt the dark corners of the Mississippi Delta to this day. Could there be any truth to the legends? Is it possible that Dr. Finch survived the fire, while imper? Obable, it is not impossible. A man as resourceful and paranoid as Finch would have likely had a contingency plan, an escape route. The cellar of his infirmary might have had a hidden tunnel leading out into the swamps, a secret exit known only to him. If he did escape, burned and disfigured, the swamps would have been the perfect place to vanish. He would have possessed the medical knowledge to treat his own injuries, at least enough to survive. And he would have the skills of a naturalist to live off the land. The idea of him continuing his work, however, seems less likely. The fire would have destroyed his equipment, his records, his entire life's work. The man who emerged from that fire would have been a broken, dethroned king, stripped of his kingdom of pain. What would such a man become? Not a master scientist, but perhaps a feral creature, driven by the ghosts of his own crimes. The sightings of a stooped figure watching from the tree line for decades after the fire are intriguing. Could this have been the real Alastair Finch, a man unable to leave the site of his greatest triumphs and failures, reduced to a ghostly observer of the world that had moved on without him? This image is, in many ways, more chilling than that of the monster in a secret lab. It is the image of a man consumed and ultimately destroyed by his own obsession, a pathetic, phantom-like figure tethered to his own personal hell on earth. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and darker. Perhaps Jacob or another of the slaves did not just set the fire. Perhaps they waited outside for Finch to emerge and enacted their own, final justice there in the mud and the rain, burying his body where it would never be found. In the absence of facts, we are left only with these haunting possibilities. The mystery of his ultimate fate is the final, unresolved chord in the macabre symphony of Blackwood Bend. He simply vanished from the pages of history, leaving behind only a blood-stained legacy and a collection of terrifying stories. The most tragic victims of Blackwood Bend are the ones whose stories are almost completely lost, the children. We know they were born, we know they were experimented on, and we know they vanished. The preserved infants dredged from the bayou account for some, but the folklore of the secret nursery in the cellar suggests that some may have been kept alive for a time. What happened to them? If the nursery was real, it's almost certain they would have perished in the fire that consumed the infirmary, their brief, tormented lives ending in smoke and flame. It is a mercy, perhaps, compared to what they would have endured had Finch's work continued. But there is one final, deeply disturbing thread of folklore that offers an alternative fate. This story, the most forbidden and least told of all the Blackwood Bend legends, claims that one or two of the children were successfully smuggled out of the infirmary in the chaos of the fire. Not by Finch, but by one of the house slaves, a woman who had been forced to act as his assistant and who, in a final act of conscience, saved a child from the flames. The legend says this child, a girl, was raised in secret in a remote community of freed slaves deep in the swamps. But she was not a normal child. She was described as being quiet, withdrawn, and possessing an unnerving, vacant stare. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in a monotone voice, seemingly devoid of any emotion. She was haunted by terrible nightmares and possessed a deep, instinctual fear of doctors and the sight of blood. The story goes that she grew up, married, and had children of her own, passing down the invisible scars of her mother's trauma and her own horrifying infancy. This legend speaks to the most insidious aspect of Finch's work. His evil did not necessarily end with the death of his victims. If a child did survive, she would have been the living embodiment of his theories, a human being whose emotional landscape was equably by before ever drew her first breath. Her survival would not have been a victory, but the ultimate tragedy, the successful conclusion of Alastair Finch's monstrous experiment. Let us return for a moment to the infirmary itself. The building is gone, but the foundation remains. For over a century, the block and stone were left undisturbed, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But in the 1970s, the owner of the land decided to finally clear the area to build a new barn. During the excavation, the work crew broke through the earth and uncovered the stone-walled cellar that Reverend Abernathy had descended into more than 140 years earlier. The discovery caused a brief local stir. Archaeologists from a nearby university were called in to examine the site. What they found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The cellar was not empty. While the larger, more obvious evidence had been removed by Finch, he had not been able to erase everything. In the corners, buried under layers of ash and debris from the fire, the archaeologists found small, personal items: a tiny leather shoe, a rusted metal clasp from a restraint, and several shards of thick glass from the broken specimen jars. But the most significant find was in the soil itself. Chemical analysis revealed unusually high concentrations of arsenic and formaldehyde, preservatives used in 19th-century anatomical studies. This was scientific proof that this cellar was not for storing roots, it was for storing bodies. The most macabre discovery, however, came from a small bricked-off alcove in the far wall. space that had been hidden behind a false wall. Inside, they found a small, locked metal box. When they finally managed to pry it open, they found it not contain gold or valuables. It contained a collection of dozens of small glass vials, each one carefully labeled with a code and filled with a dried, brownish residue. And nestled amongst them was a single, perfectly preserved human eye, floating in a cloudy, viscous fluid, staring out from its glass prison like a silent, eternal witness to the horrors that had transpired in that accursed place. The discovery of the metal box and its horrifying contents sent a shockwave through the historical community. Here was tangible, physical evidence that corroborated the darkest legends of Blackwood Bend. The preserved eye was a chilling artifact, a direct link to the mad doctor's obsession. But it was the vials that presented a new, terrifying mystery. What was the bride ray contained? Samples were sent for analysis. The technology of the 1970s struggled to identify the degraded organic material. The preliminary reports were inconclusive, suggesting it was desiccated blood serum, but of highly unusual position. The box and its contents were eventually remanded to the university's archives, where they sat for decades, a strange, disturbing footnote in local horror store. However, in the early 2000s, with the advent of advanced DNA and proton analysis, a graduate student rediscovered the box and decided to re-examine the vials as part of her dissertation. What she found was staggering. The residue in the vials was indeed derived from human blood. But it was the blood of newborns, and it contained abnormally high concentrations of specific stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, and other, stranger protein markers that the student couldn't initially identify. It appeared that Dr. Finch had been successful, at least in some crude way. He had been attempting to distill the chemical signature of terror from the blood of his infant victims. He was creating his serum of fear. The metal box was not just a collection of macabre trophies. It was his portable apothecary of horror, a kit containing the fruits of his unholy labor. The implications were chilling. Finch had managed to turn a human emotion into a physical substance. The legends were true. He was not just a butcher. He was an alchemist of pain, and this box was the only surviving evidence of his terrible, forbidden science. It was proof that his madness had a method, and his method had, in some small, terrifying way, actually worked. The re-examination of the vials from Dr. Finch's box raises a chilling question. What did he intend to do with his fear serum? And did he ever get the chance to use it? The historical record is silent. But if we allow ourselves to delve into God's obsessive petty, a distress emerges. A man who craved evil. He developed the serum against others, for his own evolution. He believed that by exposing himself to terror, himself against the emotively purging himself other, weak in empathy and compassion, he may have sought to transform a creature of pure intellect, to ordinary men. This theory paints engaged in a horrific experimentation himself with the concept of his own victim. Explain his increased reclusiveness in his. He wasn't just. He was emphasis. Of his own. If this is true, at the infirmary of his research, option of his own. Into the swamps with Dr. Alistair arrived from Edinburgh. He would have been something shaped in own monstrous creature. This speculative darkest possible of the swamp doctor. The creature haunted not just a burned man, post-human entity, a man who had his own humanity, creature made from the. It's a terrifying that his final, successful experiment upon himself. The story of Black serves as a chill in the power of instinct. How could it continue for so long? The disturbing as the crime. It was an open secret. The other plantation owners in the region almost certainly knew that something was amiss at Finch's estate. They would have heard the rumors. They would have noted, with a gentlemanly discretion, the strange absence of children and the high mortality rate among his pregnant slaves. But they did not intervene. To do so would have been to challenge the absolute authority of a fellow property owner, a bedrock principle of their society. The idea that what a man did with his property, be it land, livestock, or human beings, was his business, and his alone was a code they all lived by. To investigate Finch would be to invite scrutiny upon themselves, and none of them could afford that. Judge Carter's dismissal of Reverend Abernathy's claims was not just a case of cronyism. It was a deliberate act of systemic preservation. He was not just protecting a friend. He was protecting the entire brutal, fragile edifice of the planter class. The silence of the law, the church, and the community formed an impenetrable shield around Dr. Finch, allowing his private hell to flourish. His crimes were not just the work of one madman. They were enabled by a society that chose to look away, a culture that valued property rights over human life and deliberately deafened itself to the screams coming from just over the horizon. The true horror of Blackwood Bend is not just what happened in the infirmary, but the conspiracy of silence that allowed it to happen, a silence that was just as monstrous and just as culpable as the doctor's blade. What became of Jacob, the son of Sarah, the young man who lit the fires of retribution? His fate, like so many others in this story, is lost to the mists of history. If he successfully escaped into the swamps, he would have faced a new set of dangers: the perilous journey north, the constant threat of slave catchers and their dogs. But the folklore of the region offers one small, hopeful narrative. There is a story told in the descendant communities of freed slaves about a legendary figure known only as the Firebird, a man who was said to have escaped a demon doctor by burning his lair to the ground. This Firebird figure was known for his fierce, unyielding spirit and for helping other escaped slaves navigate the treacherous swamps to freedom. He carried a small, carved wooden bird as his emblem, a symbol of hope and defiance. It is a comforting thought that Jacob might have not only survived but thrived, transforming his personal act of vengeance into a lifelong crusade for liberation, his mother's sacrifice giving birth not to a monster, but to a hero. This narrative, whether true or not, provides a crucial counterpoint to the overwhelming darkness of the Finch saga. It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit is capable of extraordinary courage and resilience. Sarah's defiance and Jacob's bravery represent a powerful refusal to be passive victims. They fought back with the only means available to them, and in doing so, they not only ended a reign of terror, but also wrote their own defiant chapter in the history of resistance against an inhuman system. Their story, though shrouded in legend, is a testament to the enduring light that can flicker even in the most macabre and oppressive darkness. Today, the land where Blackwood Bend Plantation once stood is mostly unincorporated county land. The swamps have reclaimed much of it. The grand manor house is long gone, its foundations swallowed by vines and weeds. The only visible scar from that time is the clearing where the infirmary once stood. The excavated foundation stones are still there, a grim, rectangular outline in the earth. The land is privately owned, and the owners discourage visitors, tired of the ghost hunters and morbidly curious who are drawn to the property's dark history. But the stories persist. Locals still warn against venturing into that part of the swamp at night. They say you can still feel a cold spot near the infirmary ruins, even on the hottest Mississippi summer day. They say the land is sterile, that nothing will ever grow there again. The curse of Alastair Finch, it seems, is long-lived. The story serves as a haunted memorial, a ghost story whispered on the wind, ensuring that the victims are not entirely forgotten, even if their names are lost. The evil that transpired here was so absolute that it seems to have permanently altered the fabric of the place, leaving an indelible stain of sorrow and fear that time cannot wash away. It stands as one of America's most disturbing, yet least known, cold cases, a testament to a time when science, power, and racial hatred combined to create a perfect laboratory for a monster. The questions left behind are as unsettling as the story itself. How many other Dr. Finches were there? How many other Blackwood Bends existed, their horrors undocumented and lost to history? The silence of the past is vast and deep, and one can only wonder what other forbidden histories lie sleeping within it, waiting to be unearthed. The legacy of Dr. Alastair Finch is not confined to the haunted acres of his former plantation or the pages of obscure medical history. It is a cautionary tale that resonates even today. It speaks to the terrifying potential of unchecked authority and the dangers of dehumanization. Finch was able to commit his atrocities because his victims were not seen as human beings by the society he lived in. They were property, they were specimens, they were other. This act of stripping away humanity is the necessary first step for all great evils. Once a person or a group is deemed less than human, any horror can be justified in the name of progress, science, or ideology. Finch's infirmary was a microcosm of the larger system he inhabited, an extreme but logical extension of a society built on the principle that some lives are worth less than others. His story forces us to confront the dark potential that lies within the human heart when it is unburdened by empathy and unrestrained by accountability. It is a chilling reminder that the line between a brilliant scientist and a monster can be terrifyingly thin, and that the pursuit of knowledge without compassion can lead to the deepest, most damnable pits of hell. The ghosts of Blackwood Bend are more than just a local legend. They are a warning. They remind us to be ever vigilant against the kind of thinking that allows one human being to look at another and see not a person, but an object, a thing to be used, studied, and discarded. This, ultimately, was the most forbidden and horrifying discovery that Dr. Finch ever made. In the end, we are left with fragments, a burned foundation, a preserved eye in a dusty archive, a collection of vials filled with a mysterious substance, and a tapestry of horrifying legends. The complete truth of what happened at Blackwood Bend is likely lost forever, buried with its victims and its perpetrator. The doctor's full, unedited ledgers, the key to his methods and his madness, were almost certainly consumed in the fire, their secrets turned to ash. We can piece together the narrative from the evidence that remains, but the full scope of his cruelty, the exact number of his victims, and the final, terrible thoughts in his mind will remain a mystery. This lack of resolution is perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire saga. There is no final justice, no satisfying conclusion. There is only the lingering dread, the echo of suffering that still hangs over the land. The story of Dr. Alastair Finch and his pregnant slaves is a wound on the landscape of American history, a place where the veil of civilization was torn away to reveal the raw, screaming heart of darkness beneath. It is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not creatures of fantasy or folklore, but are made of flesh and blood. They are men who walk among us, often cloaked in respectability and intelligence, their profound evil hidden in plain sight, waiting only for the right circumstances, the perfect, silent laboratory, to be unleashed upon the world. The silence surrounding Blackwood Bend is a testament not to a forgotten story, but to a deliberately buried one. So the next time you travel through the deep, rural South, and you pass by those stretches of dark, impenetrable swamp, where the Spanish moss hangs from the cypress trees like ghostly shrouds, pause for a moment. Think of the stories the land keeps, the secrets the mud holds. Think of the places like Blackwood Bend, whose histories have been intentionally erased, their locations now known only by the cold spots and the lingering feelings of dread they impart. Think of the unnamed women who were led into a brick building for the last time, their hopes for a child twisted into a final, agonizing nightmare. Think of the infants who never drew a breath in freedom, their first and only sensations being the cold steel of a madman's instruments. The story of Dr. Alastair Finch is a journey into the abyss, a glimpse into a heart of darkness that resided not in some distant, savage land, but in the educated mind of a country doctor. And the most chilling thought of all is this: while his laboratory was destroyed, the ideas that built it, the dehumanization, the obsession with control, the belief that the ends justify any means, did not die in the flames. They are a poison that lingers in the world, a curse far more potent and enduring than any ghost, and the faint, desperate cry you might thigh. Enkei you hear on the wind may not be a spirit at all. It may just be history itself, whispering its most forbidden and horrifying truths.